And the next speaker is coming from Sweden, from Ericsson. Patrik Regårdh is head of Network Society Labs and head of strategic marketing in Ericsson. So, floor is yours here, Patrik.
Thank you very much, and good morning, Mr. President and ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor to be here in Estonia, and I've had the pleasure of that honor several times over the last couple of years, and it's always extremely inspiring to be here and to listen in and to follow up what is going on. And I can just underline the final words of Mr. President that this is really the place where things are happening. And therefore it's a strong source of inspiration. And I think that to put this into perspective, in Ericsson, we started back, I would say, somewhere around 2007 or so, to look a little bit beyond the current industry horizon. I mean, we must remember at that point of time, we were extremely engaged in building mobile telephony networks around the world. We were adding 1 billion more users every year, basically, at that pace. And I think that mobile telephony had a very strong benefit of being something that people could understand, because if you've gotten a mobile phone, going from not having one to getting one, you could easily anticipate the value of it. And by coming as an industry and promising another 1 billion users, everybody could understand the sort of contribution that it gave to society. And hence, it was easy to get the regulation, the spectrum, the financing, everything needed. And it was also something which was a very strong driver for technology, because it drove a lot of requirements in terms of how the technology should evolve. But at some time in 2007, we started to see that, of course, okay, there's going to be an end to the expansion of mobile telephony. And we also started to acknowledge that we will see a more profound change force from this technology as it comes out more broadly in society. I think that is the starting point for what we now have articulated as the network society, information society. I mean, call it whatever you want. It's basically the same kind of development. And of course, we see that that is something which is not only profoundly impacting us and the technology which we focus on, but it's also impacting society at large. So I will expand a little bit on that. I will talk a little bit about technology. I will talk a little bit about some use scenarios and also some implications, which I think it's a far bigger debate than for a company like Ericsson, but which we, of course, are a key contributor into that discussion. I mean, basically, the core observation that we are doing, and I think that was stressed already very, very well in the beginning here, is that we stand today with a completely different starting point. We have in the hands of ourselves and of people in general tools which are extremely powerful. Mostly for good, that's the way we tend to see it, but I clearly agree also that there are sort of negative implications of this technology. But in general, I think it has provided an empowerment in many different dimensions, from how you develop your skill sets, how you can act in a market, how you can gather information, how you can share information, and all of that is something that gradually has evolved into a very strong power in society at large. And I think that it also has a very strong impact on business. And if we think of business not necessarily as the commercial side of society, basically activities in society, we could have a broader connotation of business. And business is now profoundly impacted by the sort of the power of us in a wide sense. I have one small example from a colleague of mine who was making I started to think about when we're talking about tax declaration, because a year ago he was making his tax declaration, and in Sweden we have not the kind of identity system that you have in Estonia, so there is a sort of clients that needs to be downloaded, and his e-legitimation, as it's called in Sweden, didn't work. So out of pure frustration he made the tweet, why can't Nordea get my e-legitimation to work? It took him 1 hour before his personal banker called him back and asked what's the problem. And I think that's, in a very simple manner, an example of how business, in a broad sense, is starting to change. But also, of course, that we see that information technology is something that is being built into business in a profoundly different way, and I'll come back to that. And I think from an Ericsson point of view, the core conclusion or the core observation here is that our technology, which we used to develop for a nice industry vertical called telecom, is now being used in a much more wider way. It's being used as a horizontal, as a basic infrastructure. And we started to look at that infrastructure in a different way. And I mean, just give you one observation that we did. I mean, talking about cities, for instance, and the city infrastructure is an area which we, of course, have spent a lot of energy on. As cities, we have the trends of urbanization, and we have the cities sort of driving the world economy. And we then came to the conclusion that, wow, if we look at Ericsson's position in the market, that can be expressed in relation to operators, which are our customers. And then we don't really see cities, because they buy things and they put it up wherever. But if we start to look at the city and the city infrastructure, we can see that we hold a market position where we are providing 40% of the digital infrastructure, mobile digital infrastructure, to the top 100 cities of the world. And we are more than twice the size of any of our competitors. And I think that comes first the fascination, but then secondly, of course, an obligation also to make sure that we can be an integrated part in the much wider function of a city. So I think that is how we have started to look at the infrastructure. And just to put this a little bit into perspective, I think that this covers a lot what was already said, but I mean, it starts very much with an infrastructure-centric thing. Building the connections, making sure that you have the data networks, that you have all the devices and everything in place, and then it becomes very much about separate applications in a wide sense. But I think we have gone forward then into what I would call more of a practices, where ICT, information and communication technology, is being deeply integrated into a number of practices. But I think largely speaking, and I think maybe Estonia is an exception, but generally speaking, it has been integrated more as a back-end enabler in those practices to take away activities and improve the process, the way which you do things, to become a new enabler for new means to outsource. I mean, if we take, for instance, e-business, we had in Sweden, the Bo.com was a company that burned a couple of billion Swedish crowns on building their own e-business platform. If any of us during today would come up with the idea to set up an e-business, we would take the whole process from Amazon, most likely. So it's sort of a complete new means of how you structure and organize your activities. And I think that provides a significant contribution. But as we go forward, I think that we also now start to see an infrastructure which is starting to feed back. It's not just a means to simplify and make more efficient communication or interaction. It is something that starts to feed back and becomes more a sort of an element or a platform for a new kind of innovation. We were discussing yesterday around forecasting, and we've been spending 50 years to figure out how to do weather forecasting. You can discuss the quality of it, but it's decent. With this kind of infrastructure, we can start to do traffic forecasting with a similar kind of accuracy. And of course, if you have a traffic forecasting on how the roads are going to look like, that can impact the way which you take decisions. It opens some interesting aspects around game theory if you get that feedback and you can influence it again. So it opens a number of very, very exciting things. But I think in this phase of integration, the starting point is very much something different than the classic starting point. I mean, I use, when I go to work, a social service called Waze. I don't know if you're acquainted with it. It gives me an update of the state of the traffic. It gives me an update from what comments that others has made. It's an extremely useful tool for my commuting to work. The thing is that if we talk with Waze, their core asset is the people traveling on the roads. That's the way which they have defined traffic and transportation or commuting. If I talk to the road authorities, their view of the asset is the concrete and the steel and the traffic signs and everything. So it's a completely different perspective. And this technology enables us to take completely new perspectives. And I think that leads us into some kind of a perspective where we have to start to recognize that things that seemed ridiculously impossible just a couple of years ago is now becoming a complete possibility. We can do things radically different. This is a quote from Seth Godin, who has been focusing very much on the media industry, and I think that's a place where that has been sort of one of the forerunners, but I don't think media industry is any exception to any other industry going forward. So I think that this is something which we need to build into the way which we act. And then if we look at sort of government ICT relation, this is an area which we have also looked into a little bit, and we, particularly in relation to city development, and we did some mapping around some of the 25 largest cities of the world in terms of what is the payback that cities in general get from the ICT infrastructure. And we could see that there is a clear correlation between how much ICT you put in and what benefit you get out from socio-economic and environmental perspective. But we could also see that the cities that had the capability to articulate and implement the vision has a far better output than the cities that are unable to articulate or to implement the vision. So I think that the vision element, and that's also why I'm so inspired by places like Estonia, where the vision has been so sort of well thought out from the beginning and have been so present in the whole development. And I think that is really something which is key. And that is probably going to be even more crucial as we go forward and tackle some of these opportunities and challenges that we talked about. But it's of course also a question of dealing with reality. I mean, one of my favorite examples is the city of Sao Paulo that started to demand e-invoices. And I don't think it was a very sophisticated type of e-invoice from anybody making business with the city. And obviously that lifted the literacy level, ability to use ICT fundamentally throughout the city, because if you wanted to do business with the city, you needed a computer, you needed to be computerized at some level. So I think that in some cases it's very small actions, particularly in the early stage of development, and not the grand projects that necessarily makes the big difference. So it's a match between sort of finding the reality steps and also then working with a vision from that perspective. Technology-wise, I mean, this is our home turf. This is what we thrive at as a company. And this is basically a picture which somehow summarizes some of the key requirements as we see that we are now looking into the 5th generation of mobile technology. And I mean, typically here you find demands which goes far beyond the communication service that has been the sort of the bulk business of the telecom industry. We are looking basically in all areas into capabilities that supports new kind of usage. If it's for industrial use, if it's for a changed working lifestyle in terms of being able to work with fundamentally new tools, but from another place than the office location, or if it's to support a plethora of small devices sending what kind of sensor data, etc. Also security aspects. I mean, we're talking about using the public infrastructure for road-to-road, for car-to-car communication, which is of course something which is extremely critical, particularly if it's used for more than just leisure information, if it's for critical traffic information. So there's a whole array of new kind of applications which we are building into the technology. So my point by shifting from technology or into integration is not that technology is not important, but I think that the issues is moving away from technology, because this we can solve. There's not a question. It may be a question of time in some aspects, but in generally we can sort of build a network, we can build an infrastructure which can meet any kind of requirements that comes from society. I think that is a core message. We used also some of this, continuing around the issue of cities. This is an area where we have been developing a set of scenarios, which I think maybe could be useful to drive a broader discussion about what are the sort of implications going forward. Here we looked at 3 scenarios around sustainability, proactivity, and responsiveness. And this particular screen dump is from a responsiveness kind of situation, where we are playing around with extracting a lot of information in relation to, I think in this case, there were somewhere that a truck which came into an incident with some dangerous cargo. And of course that can stimulate or can activate a number of sensors to find out the kind of pollution or local pollution. It can stimulate video streams, of course, to alert various authorities being involved. It can stimulate the redirection of the traffic flow on the streets. It can also stimulate alerts to people being in the neighborhood that they should avoid going in certain parts of the city or whatever. So I think that this is just sort of one illustration of how we can move into a set of scenarios where this infrastructure is starting to feed back, not only on this traffic forecasting line of thinking, but also dealing with acute, immediate situations, but also dealing with more longer-term planning issues in terms of understanding patterns and behaviors fundamentally differently. I mean, at the core of this, I think at the bottom here we have basically all kinds of sectors of society, and I think it comes very much along the line that you have started the implementation here in Estonia in terms of making sure that those are not isolated verticals or isolated activities, but that they have some level of layer where information can be shared and displayed, and that information then can be available both for sort of inclusion perspectives, for planning perspectives, as well as more operation perspectives from a sort of a city operation center kind of scenario, which we have in mind. I mean, this knowledge layer circles very much about gathering information, securing that information is accurate and correct, provide that in a way that it's structured and can be analyzed for various different purposes. So this is not sort of a silo process, but that you can tap into that. you can add knowledge and logic, and then also, of course, add various kinds of simulation and decision-making test aspects, and then, of course, implement it, and it becomes more of a circle because that changes, obviously, the data. And you can see, once again, see this at a minute level, or you can see it at a 10-decade level. So it's basically, it's not limited in time from that perspective. And I think we talked about that also a little bit. I mean, this provides, of course, a number of opportunities. And I mean, here we are focusing more on the benefit side in terms of how it can improve the utilization of the society assets in a broad sense. Steel or concrete infrastructure, as well as human infrastructure and human capital, etc., to speed up. But also, of course, improve the precision in what kind of services and how the different sectors of society works in relation of feeding back that. And not the least the trust and transparency issue in terms of making sure that people put a better sort of respect into the different sectors of society. And I mean, on a citizen point of view, obviously there's a flip side of that, which turns it into engagement and participation, etc. And I think from a business point of view, there is endless opportunities then to evolve into new kind of business proposition, whether it's this wise social networking for commuters, or whether it's completely other kind of solutions coming up here, which was unthinkable a couple of years ago, clearly. So I think that it holds a lot of very exciting opportunities to create substantial benefits and values as we evolve. But I think it also holds some sort of governance aspect, and now I'm getting out on very deep water because I'm clearly leaving the domain of our technology and going into other areas. But I think that is defendable, and it's right to take that discussion. And if we look about the governance perspective, I think there is a lot of issues around information. I mean, the protection, the rights, the security, all of that, those aspects needs to be dealt with. And I think that holds a high degree of technology in satisfying and outlining how those solutions looks like. But it also holds a number of other competences that needs to come into this discussion. So it's not primarily, in my mind at least, it's not primarily a technology issue. It's more of a regulative and sort of society aspect that needs to come into this discussion. But then on top of that, of course, comes another layer in terms of how will the marketplace look like? What are the roles that emerge out of this kind of a scenario? What are the regulative aspects as we can see cross sectors coming together? I mean, another case we were speculating around is health. I think in many countries you have sick care. You go there when you're sick. It's not really healthcare. We call it healthcare, but it's not really healthcare because it's sick care. You have to have sort of a well-diagnosed illness to be able to get some kind of an action happening. But then on the other hand, we have places like gyms and those places where people go for their wellness or for their health. And it's not very far-fetched to see, in light of all this development, that a player coming from that corner starts to develop with the help of DNA, with the help of cloud sourcing, with the help of collaborative measures, etc., to build not a waste platform for commuting back and forth work, but a whatever it will be called, I can't come up with a name, but some platforms for healthiness, and starts to come up with rather sophisticated advices and services. And of course that shifts the logic around healthcare as we know it today quite significantly. Just as one small example of how we see that the sort of the marketplace is changing, and some of that change we maybe want to stimulate, and other change we maybe want to limit because it holds more challenges than opportunities. But then, sort of at a higher level on this slide, at least, I don't know if it's a higher level generally speaking, but I think it also plays back into ideology. I mean, we have. When I listen to the politics, primarily in Sweden, which is the place where I follow it on a daily basis, but I think in Europe, in US in general, I think we have a logic in many places which goes back to the shift from farming to industrial. That is the sort of founding point of the ideologies which are the prevailing, setting the prevailing discourse areas and topics in society. And I think that when we start to see this development, I fully subscribe to the idea that ICT is just yet another rationalizer. It's not something evil that should be fought, but we need to deal with it. I mean, after all, we left the farmland to go into the factories. We left the factories to go into the offices. And I'm sure we're going to leave the offices to go somewhere else. And the question is, where is that somewhere else? And what are we going to do in that somewhere else place? And I think that is something which touches on some of the very fundamental and basic things around how we want to see our life develop and how we want to see our society develop. And I'm bringing this up because I clearly see that the technology that we're talking about here, in general terms, plays all the way up and cannot be dealt with on an information layer or a market layer. It actually has an implication on that layer. And once again, this is not an area for Ericsson to drive, but we are extremely sort of eager to participate and contribute into this discussion. So that would be my sort of final remark in terms of linking it into the bigger and wider governance topic. Thank you.
So is there any comments, questions to Patrik? I think this is a really good question, where we go after we go out from office, or we are kicked off from office.
Yes.
There's no place in the office anymore soon. Probably in many offices there are less workplaces than staff who must work there.
Yes, yes. And it's also, I think it's such a profound power. I met with Brian Arthur, professor from California, and he told me that he had been looking at this and he'd been writing articles and books about the concept of digital economy, etc. And he said that I've always had the perspective that this sort of rationalization, that's going to happen to somebody else. But now he has come clearly to the conclusion that universities is one of the domains that is going to change maybe next after the media industry, and where the change is going to be equally profound, and professor is not a safe place to be just because you are on a high intellectual level. So it's not something that we can sort of distanciate ourselves from. And where we're going to be, I don't know, the fireplace might be a nice place, I don't know. Culture and social values, maybe, I don't know.
Less work.
Yeah. The farm.
Back to farm.
Back to farm, yeah.
Thank you very much, Patrik.
Thank you.